The purpose of the study was to not only potentially advise policy on this topic, but also to promote better quality conditions for better quality care. But the research question that this is based off of is to examine the phenomenon of recruitment and employment of temporary migrant caregivers and how institutional changes over time, over the last 25 years, have affected their experiences, conditions, and perceptions. Yeah, caregivers in Israel, they are the largest group of temporary labor migrants that have been going through a lot of changes in the past several decades. So I had an online survey that had questions which were statistically examined. I also had follow-up interviews, which had more qualitative data and like thick descriptions and anecdotes that I was able to use as well. So one of the most important findings I got from the interviews was I was able to sit down with some caregivers and kind of draw out this detailed map of the chain of illegal brokerage fees. These are fees that caregivers pay in order to get their job letter of sponsorship, which allows them to get a visa to come to Israel. Two pieces I wanted to highlight are these third-party recruitment agents in their country of origin that the recruitment agency hires and kind of draws them in. They're paid often in cash under the table, as well as the placement agent in Israel. That these are often former caregivers that are working for Israeli employment agencies, getting paid under the books and bringing them workers. So they often stay with these people in small apartments when they first arrive or when they're in between jobs. And there's a lot of illegal cash payments going on in relation to these third-party agents. Also, the most common issue as far as work conditions that was found in the interviews was because there's no legally allotted time for rest hours, there was a ton of issues with severe lack of sleep. You know, if you have elderly patients, for example, with Alzheimer's or medical conditions, you're up all night with them. All night, and you know they would go with chronic lack of sleep, and that led to a host of other issues.
So I did research on anti-immigrant attitudes and LGBT identity. So my research question was whether and to what extent are attitudes towards immigrants/immigration in Western Europe affected by LGBT identity. So there was a bit of previous research that did show that LGBTQ members do express more sympathy and they do hold more liberal views and attitudes on topics such as race, gender, immigration when compared to heterosexuals. And so kind of getting into our theoretical framework a bit, there's a theory called cultural marginality. And cultural marginality can be explained as like a victimhood position or like an underdog theory that for marginalized groups increases sympathy towards other marginalized groups. There's also research that shows that there's a strong and growing correlation between the political left being pro-immigrant and the political right being anti-immigrant. So with that knowledge base, plus the fact that there's also studies that show because the political left is more pro-equality, lesbian, gay, and bisexuals tend to prefer political left ideologies and political parties. There's a theory called political mobilization too, that LGBs, because they associate with the political left, they're mobilized to prefer more political left policies, in this case, potentially more friendly immigration policies. So the data that I used comes from the European Social Survey. We did 8 rounds, which comes from 2002 to 2016, with the cumulative data from 12 Western European countries. But we can see just from this first graph, there's a general tendency for lesbian, gays, and bisexuals to have more positive attitudes towards immigrants. Here's a similar chart, but this is opposition to immigration. Once again, heterosexuals are red and LGBs are green. We can still see in this percent distribution, there's still a general tendency for LGBs to have less opposition to immigration when compared to heterosexuals. So lastly, just a few conclusions that we've got from our research was that LGBs, lesbian, gay, and bisexuals tend to express lower level of anti-immigrant attitudes than heterosexuals, regardless of demographic characteristics and socioeconomic position. Plus, perceived discrimination, acknowledging of one's group marginality position, almost fully explains more positive attitudes of LGBT respondents towards immigrants as compared to heterosexual compatriots. And finally, political orientation is only partially responsible for the association between sexuality and anti-immigrant attitudes.